Hello everybody, today I'm going to be taking a look at another fascinating Japanese computer that I own, which is the PC-88, or in my case, the NEC PC-8801mkIIFR. A very long model name. Let me read it again. NEC PC-8801mk2FR. That's a mouthful. But this is a very interesting computer due to its role in Japanese computer gaming and the Japanese computer market, and especially what it meant for Japanese computer gaming in general. This is a very fascinating Z80 8-bit microcomputer that came out, well, the original one came out before the PC-98 did, but it was sold side by side with the PC-98 until like the late 80s, early 90s. Alright, so just as a heads up, I'm not as familiar with the PC-88 or NEC's 8-bit computers like I am the PC-98, which is the 16-bit and then 32-bit series. I'm not as familiar with that as I am with the PC-98, so if I get some things wrong, just understand that. So anyways, here's what I was able to find out though. In 1979, NEC came out with a home computer or 8-bit computer called the PC-8001, and it was a sales success and it conquered quite a bit of the market. So NEC a few years later would start coming out with more computers to get even more of the market. There was the PC-6001, which was a lower end home computer. There was the PC-8801, which was kind of a successor to the PC-8001, even though they were sold side by side for quite some time. And then there was the PC-9801, which came out 1 year after the 8801 did. The 8801 came out in 81. The 9801 came out in 82 and was a 16-bit business computer as opposed to the 8-bit home computer the PC-88 was. And the PC-88 sold quite a bit. And then they made the MK2, which was it was a newer, slimmer version in a case kind of like this one. And it sold a bit too because there's plenty of those on sale in the used market and they're not worth very much, and I'll explain why. And then in 1985, NEC would come out with the PC-8801 MK2 SR. Now the SR was the most important PC-8801 model ever released because it came out with what was called V2 mode, which it's labeled right there, N88 V2 mode. And it came out with V2 mode, and that was an improved graphics mode that games could use. And so a lot of games were written for the 8801 MK2 SR in particular. NEC would release a few models afterwards, such as the FR, which is a cost-reduced version of the SR without... Well, let me explain. All the PC-88s up to the SR had a backwards compatibility mode for the PC-8001 in some degree. I don't know how well it works because I don't own an SR, I own an FR, so I can't test it. But they removed that mode in the FR so it can only run PC-8801 programs because it does not have a backwards compatible graphics implementation. Now, I don't know how backwards compatible that is, like I said, because I have no way of proving it, or if it was just for porting stuff over, or if it's useless or whatever, but what I do know is that mode was taken out of the FR, which was a cost-reduced version of the SR. And then they also made a version called the MR, which has 1.2 meg floppies instead of 360K floppies, which this one has. Just the old school 360K 40-track drive. Old school. And then they made a bunch of other models after the FR. They made some with 8 megahertz, some with a better sound chip. So the SR also added a YM2203 sound chip, which is what the PC-9801-26K has. But NEC would also come out with, before the 9821, a YM2608 sound card. And it was on some of the newer models too. And even better, that YM2608 sound card had RAM. So you could use the sample functionality that the PC-98s could not have unless you soldered RAM to the chip itself. There were some other interesting PC-88 models worth talking about. There was the PC-88 VA series, which was kind of like the Apple IIGS series in America. The PC-88 VA was a 16-bit enhancement to the PC-88 series with better graphics, more colors, 16-bit, but it didn't sell as well, and it didn't have as many games for it. And not only that, but whenever they come up for sale, they are very expensive because there weren't many of them, and some of them break. And I'll explain why many of these PC-88s break when I take this case off. But there's a lot of PC-88 VAs going for crazy prices. The other notable computer release, well, there's actually two more I want to talk about. The first is the PC-88MC. Well, no, it's 8801MC. And that was a PC-88 tower that could have the CD drive from the TurboGrafx 16 or PC Engine, as it's called in Japan, plug into it, and you could actually have a CD drive on your PC-88. And not many games obviously use that. Because the thing is, on the PC-88, pretty much everything was designed for the MK2SR. So if you have a newer model, well, the only advantage you can take advantage of is either YM2608 support in games that supported it, or you can also get on those models 8 megahertz, which some games like Star Cruiser I've heard use to accelerate the game. And the other PC-88 model worth talking about is the PC-98 DO. Now, why am I mentioning a PC-98 in this 88 video? Well, the DO was a very unique model that had a PC-88 backwards compatibility mode. So you could run PC-88 games on your 98. And the thing is, the DO wasn't exactly that good of a PC-98 or that good of a PC-88, but it sold a bit because, it would allow you to play games for both. So people pay money for those as well. So those three models people will pay big money for. And if you see anybody with one of those three models, you can tell they are a die-hard PC-88 collector. That's all I can really say. Anyways, the MK2FR is kind of one of the later early models in a way, because I'll explain why in a second, but there's a few things I want to point out with this model. The main thing I want to point out is this keyboard connector. This keyboard connector is, as you can see, it has 13 pins. 13 pins. Why does it have 13 pins? Well, the keyboard actually, the controller's in the computer itself, and then it breaks out to the keyboard, and the keyboard is just a dumb array of switches. Kind of weird how that works. Now, later PC-88s would actually move to using a more modern keyboard connector, kind of like on the PC-98, where it's got a keyboard controller and special keys, and those are easier to adapt to because there's keyboard adapters for those on Yahoo Japan, but not this model. So you actually have to find a real PC-88 keyboard. Looking at the back here, we can see several connectors that are familiar and some that are unfamiliar. There's a power plug here, which allows you to plug it into the wall, obviously, along with the ground pin for if you're plugging it into a Japanese power outlet. But there's also a volume control in the back, which allows you to turn the volume up and down. There's an analog RGB connector compatible with the PC-98 and pretty much every Japanese computer that used that 15-pin connector. So you can plug in a PC-98 monitor and it'll work. At least many monitors seem to work on both anyways. But if you plug in a VGA monitor that does the low scan rate, I think it's 15 kilohertz, it'll work. There's digital RGB, which is your TTL video port, because a lot of 8-bit computers and the early PCs had TTL digital video out, which wasn't as good, and it couldn't do as many colors. There's a line out for the YM2203 sound and the beeper. There's a serial port labeled RS232C. There's an I/O port that's basically a variant of the Sega Genesis or Atari controller port, and you can use MSX controllers on there just fine, along with mice for the PC-88. There's a CMT connector. I think that might be a special connector. I don't know what that is. And a special printer connector for old school printers of the time from Japan. And then there's an expansion slot. You only get one on this model. I think others might have more, but it's a much wider connector, or plug, than the C-bus is. I don't know how the physical connector looks, but it's a much wider slot than on C-bus with the PC-98s. I mean, if you put a C-Bus card next to it, let me just show you one real quick. It's a much wider slot than the C-Bus slot used on the PC-98s is. And that's the I/O you have on this thing. Let's take a look inside. Inside the PC-88, it's a very packed machine. And I mean it's packed like Fort Knox almost. There's two of these floppy drives, which are Teak FD55 BVs. There's a big 100-volt AC fan that's very noisy. I tried to peel the sticker off to lubricate it, but there's no way to lubricate this. It's a mini Ace 25 100-volt fan. We've got ourselves a speaker right here. And over in here, we've got some of our chips that make the chip setup. There's a bunch of ICs. There's probably the Z80 CPU buried beneath the floppy drives, along with the graphics chips and ROMs and whatnot. But what's very notable is this, or what was here. This is the #1 killer of old PC-88s that I've removed, and that is the battery. Now, the battery is a very infamous NICD battery, and these are sometimes nicknamed Varda bombs because a lot in Western computers were called Varda batteries, or they were made by Varda, and they leak. And it gets around all these chips here, sometimes all the way to the connectors, and they just kill every old PC-88 that has not had this battery pulled. And unlike on a PC-98 where you have to install a clock battery and a blocking diode to keep it from trying to charge, you can just rip the battery out and it's still going to work perfectly. Unlike on a PC-98, you're not going to lose anything really. Well, on PC-98s like the VM or the UV, you're going to get beep codes and it's not going to really boot until you give it voltage of some sort. But here, you can just rip it out and it'll work fine. So that's what I did. I ripped the dang thing out and it's gone, and I don't have to worry about corrosion eating away at the motherboard. Just like that. Very interesting, but that's why I thought I'd show you that. So if you have a PC-88, rip that thing out. And that's the expansion connector, which is a bit smaller than that expansion slot. Anyways, let's put it back together and turn it on. Let's talk about the keyboard a bit. The PC-8801mkIIFR keyboard, which is what this is from, uses a weird type of, I think it's a foam and foil or weird type of slider switch. It feels and sounds weird. It's definitely not as high quality as the switches used in later PC-98s. I mean, those like to jam anyway, but that keyboard feels nicer and higher quality. This feels kind of cheaper in a way. But it does the job, and it's much better than, say, a ZX Spectrum keyboard where it's literally just rubber, or the Atari 400 and its membrane keyboard that was infamous. I think you know what I mean, but yeah. It's a weird keyboard. One more thing I might as well show before I turn this thing on is the front of the machine. So there are two switches right here. There's a speed switch and a mode switch. And this mode switch switches between V1 and V2. And then this switch switches between low speed and high speed. And these switches are there for backwards compatibility with old PC-8801 games. For example, LGR and his original PC-8801. If you wanted to play games for his PC-88, you would have to push those switches over here, and then you could play them. There's also a bunch of dip switches here, which I'm not really sure what they do, and I think you need the documentation to figure out what they do. But those dip switches change a bunch of stuff with like video and sync rate and a few other things to my knowledge. And those switches, they're there, and if you want to change something, you can always use those switches. Holy shit. Alright, so the storm's mostly passed. Back to filming. So, let me turn on the PC-88 to demonstrate how this model operates. And one more thing I forgot to mention. On later PC-88s, instead of having these switches, there's actually a key you press while turning the machine on, and it will kick you into a boot menu or setup menu, and then you can just change the settings that you would change on the switches here. And these PC-88s will also display what mode they're in, CPU-wise or video-wise. So if you turn on a PC-88 that's later, it might say V2 in green text or V2 8 megahertz in green text. So that's what later PC-88s will do. But since this is an older machine, I'm going to show you what it does when I turn it on. So the first thing it does is it tries to read a floppy from drive 1, which is on this side. The other thing that happens is one of these lights comes on, and that tells you what mode the PC-88 is in. It's either in V1 or V2. On later PC-88s, such as the VA, on the VA series, there's a V3 mode, which is the 88 VA mode. But it also has the V1 and V2. While on the SR, it'll have a third light for essentially the original PC-8001 mode. So if I turn it off, and I switch it here, V1 mode comes on instead. And older PC-88 games need V1 mode. If you're playing a game made before the SR came out, that is. Which this will play, but you have to turn it to V1 mode. So, let's show you what it does when I turn the computer on from the computer itself. Alright, let's turn on the PC-88. So we've got a blinking cursor and several things at the bottom similar to that of the later PC-98s, which carried this over when you boot into BASIC or DOS. And these are mapped to the function keys on the keyboard, which are F1 through 5, because we don't have 10 on a PC-98, like on a PC-98. So it's going to ask how many files, and we push enter. Oh, I think we didn't hook up the keyboard properly. So on these PC-88s, because the MK2 keyboard has the plug in the opposite direction, you have to wiggle the connector to get all 13 pins to connect. I just wiggled the connector. And let's wait for it to come on. So this PC-88 has a 4.77, from what I know, Z80 processor. I think it's either 4 or 4.77, but it's a slower CPU than what's on the later PC-88s, which can do more colors. I'm going to have to reconnect the keyboard. Now the problem with the older PC-88 MK2 is that the keyboard plug was swapped. And what I mean is it plugs in the opposite direction, so the cable is molded in the wrong direction on this keyboard. So I have to wiggle it to get it to work. And the problem is you can't really find keyboards for a decent price for this machine, or adapters. You have to use what you can get. Well, in this case, I had to hit the enter key several times, because this keyboard's also very finicky, but and you can see right here the keyboard is very finicky because I'm having to push several times or push really hard for each one to go in, so it wasn't that issue. This is not a fun keyboard. Let me try pushing the E key. Same problem as with these old PC-98 keyboards. The keyboards for these things just did not age that well. What a shame. And it's just basic. or well, the PC-88 dialect of BASIC called N88 BASIC, which is an extended version of BASIC to some degree. That's if it's anything like the PC-98 version of N88 BASIC. But you might be thinking this is a boring BASIC machine. But it's not, because not only did it have a port of CP/M, but it even had games for it. In fact, this is what the PC-88 is best known for, are games. The PC-88 was, up until like the early 90s, it was one of the main computer gaming platforms of Japan. There were many games written that were only on the PC-88, or they were on other computers, but they just weren't as good, or they were port multiplats or whatnot. So, the thing with the PC-88 is, it was the mainstream gaming platform for computer games in Japan for quite some time, especially when the SR came out. There were a good few years when so many games were written for this Z80-based computer from Japan. And even if a game was going to be on the Sharp X1 or the FM7 or FM77AV or the MSX or the PC-98, it was guaranteed it was going to have a PC-88 version of some sort. And that's because everybody had a PC-88, or well, it was the most popular. So there were games that might have been on a few of the computers, but they were guaranteed to have a PC-88 version. And so the PC-88 is flooded with good games, at least for its time. There's a problem with the PC-88 though, and that is not a lot of the games have fan translations. There's fewer fan translations than there are for the PC-98 because, well, a lot of people outside Japan learned about the PC-98 because one of the games on it became a smash hit overseas years later, and it was the sequels to it. But if you wanted to play the old ones, you had to download a PC-98 emulator. And then on top of that, there's also the MSX, which has a lot more because MSXs were sold in Europe, and therefore there were a ton of people outside Japan who grew up with the MSX, and even when the MSX was still relevant, people were making fan translations back in the 90s to share with their European friends and whatnot. So the MSX has a bunch of them, the PC-98 has a bunch of recent ones, the PC-88, the FM77AV and FM7, and the Sharp X1 have basically been left to the wayside. So this, the FM7, the X1, there's just not a lot of fan-translated games, but there's a lot of games you can play on this thing, however. And there's a good YouTube channel called Basement Brothers. I'll put a link in the description. They do a lot of reviews of fascinating PC-88 and PC-98 games, including many untranslated ones that someday somebody will translate. So let me show you one interesting PC-88 game. This was not on the 98, believe it or not. There was a PC-98 version in production, but they canceled it because of technical difficulties of some sort. So I'm going to be showing you this game in a second, but like I said, the PC-88 just had many games until the 90s when the PC-98 inevitably took over because it was a newer 16-bit more powerful computer than the PC-88 was. That's just what happened. More people bought the 98s than they did the 88 VA. And yet the thing is, the PC-88 still has tons of games. And interestingly enough, some games have better sound than the PC-98 versions because the PC-88 got the YM2608 first before the 98 did. So here's one game for the PC-88. Let's see if the discs are good. There's the volume knob. Did they really put the volume knob next to the power cable? Seriously? But this game right here is Telenet's Megami Tensei. Yes, that Megami Tensei. You know, the series that would spawn Persona and all those other games, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne with Dante from Devil May Cry. This was the origin of it, or one of them. because basically there was a book, and it was kind of a multimedia project where Atlas developed their own game, and then there was another game developed by Telenet for the computers. But Atlas's was developed for the consoles. It was a sales hit. They would buy the rights to make games for the franchise, and they would take it in their own direction. But anyways, this is a PC-88, what do you call it? It's a Gauntlet-like game developed by Telenet instead of being an RPG like the ones Atlas would develop. And Atlas's was more successful. They would take it in their own direction. But the whole premise of this game is it was based on a book where this kid wanted to get back at the bullies, so he wrote a demon summoning program and summoned demons and screwed up the whole world. And that's basically how the series started. They made the Atlas game based on it, and then this game based on it. If you escape to start the game. And it's loading from the floppies. And as you can also hear, this has a Yamaha sound chip. This isn't like a beeper booper. I'm trying to remember what key starts the game. Spacebar. And now you're going to see what PC-80 graphics look like. They look a bit better than the Spectrum, that's for sure. This isn't a ZX Spectrum. I think I've got issues loading the floppy. So I had to dig out my Pentium 4, which has a 5 1/4 inch drive, and the SamDisk software to write these floppy disks with. And once I did that, I was able to re-image the disks and get them working. And because this keyboard's dodgy and doesn't exactly work quite well, I dug this out. This is a Genesis gamepad, and I've used a Genesis to MSX adapter, so I can properly play this game with the famous Sonic game, the gamepad used for Sonic and Streets of Rage and all that stuff. So this is a PC-88 game. I can say it definitely looks better than a ZX Spectrum game. I mean, there is a thing though, and that is the dithering. Oh, this is a bit hard. So as you can see, the scrolling's kind of dodgy, but also there's a lot of effects that are designed to be dithered. And you can't see them very well because this is on a modern LCD. So when you play this game with an LCD, there's going to be dithering effects that you just don't see, because this game was designed to be displayed on a low-end PC-88 monitor, where the dot pitch was poor, and not on a modern LCD, which displays everything as how it's received. Kind of like CGA in a way. But here I am playing the Telenet Megami Tensei game, or one of the first Megami Tensei games. This is a game that's not on the PC-98 because the PC-98 version was cancelled before it came out. It is on the FM7, it's on, or FM77AV I mean. It's also on the MSX, and I think it's on the X1. The MSX version is the only one translated because you know how I mentioned about translating? Well, that's the thing. MSX games get translated because there were people who owned the MSXs back in the day, and there were people who actually played this game as an MSX import back in the day, believe it or not. There were people who imported this game and played it on the MSX, and they had no idea what it was based on. The MSX port was inferior, they had no idea what it was based on, they had no idea what the text was, so they didn't like it very much. At least some of the old reviews I was able to find for this game on the MSX. But this is the PC-88 version with higher res graphics, and that's a running theme with some of these Japanese computers. They had higher res. That was the big thing to display the Japanese character set. So this is a 640 by 200 game to my knowledge. It's not some low res, some even lower res game. And as you can see, my health is getting low, and also there's a moon phase indicator, kind of like on the later Megami Tensei games. And I'm not very good at this game, but But the thing is, this game is mostly playable with controller, but if you want to pause, you have to hit the escape key on the keyboard. You can't do that on the... You can't do that on the controller. And there you go. Not that great compared to what would be released on the Famicom, the game that would basically kick off an entire series. This was just, I think to many people, just a mid-Gauntlet clone. But hey, it's Megami Tensei on the PC-88, a game that many people are not familiar with, and it's the kind of stuff you expect to find on the PC-88, just obscure games that you might be familiar with. So when you hit the B button, it actually lets you switch between items, like weapons and stuff. There you have it, Megami Tensei on the PC-88. And so there's some more gameplay of it, and I think I'm going to take a break from this for now. So the PC-88 is a very fascinating system, to be honest. I mean, this was an 8-bit computer that was very popular in Japan. It had a lot of games that, since I don't really know Japanese, that are going to go over my head. But it just has a lot of games. You'll have to take my word there for that. And I'll post a link to another channel. Now, of course, this is a Z80-based computer, and so as a result, I do have to fulfill the tradition of running, well, CP/M on the PC-88. Now, CP/M was an operating system that was really popular in the 8-bit era. It was written by a company called Digital Research, and it has a lot of history to it, especially because it was the main influence for DOS. And there's a lot of stories about CP/M, about how it was developed, about Microsoft and their role in it, and all that stuff. So there's a lot of lore to CP/M that I'm not going to talk about in this video. But what I will be doing is showing you a little bit of it. Oh, come on. This keyboard. So we've just got M80.com. There's not a lot of stuff. Let's switch to B. And let's play the most famous game for it. This is Zork, the famous CP/M game, the famous game for old computers, made by Infocom, and ported to pretty much anything, including Call of Duty Black Ops. Yes, there's an interpreter for this game in Black Ops, and this was a cheat code everybody knew back in the day. You had to get to the computer after breaking out of the chair in the main menu, and you had to go type Zork on it, and it's something you don't see on new games, because nowadays you can't have fun anymore with new games. But in Call of Duty Black Ops, you could actually play this game. And so a lot of people are somewhat familiar playing this game, if they cared, in that game. In fact, if you had a USB keyboard or a chat pad, you could even type it in instead of just type with your controller. And here I am, playing Zork with a broken keyboard. This keyboard is garbage. And there you go. There's Zork, as playable as it is with a keyboard that's clearly on its last legs. I've never played this game much, and I'm struggling with the keyboard, as you can see, because I accidentally hit enter twice. But there you go, Zork on the PC-98, or PC-88. PC-88 Zork on CP/M. Exactly what a Z80 computer was intended to do. And that's all that needs to be said. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.